How long can South Africa borrow from the future to fund ANC's corruption today? Is the ANC, with the useless Cyril the Chief Clown, sleepwalking South Africa into economic collapse? The cancellation of USAID money, the potential loss of AGOA privileges, and Trump's new tariffs, maybe sanctions, South Africa's debt stands at 76% of GDP, way above the IMF's safe threshold of 60%. If debt becomes unpayable, South Africa has to...
Guys, this is actually one of the topics that actually interests me so much because it actually takes me back to my PhD studies where I did a lot of study on the IMF and the World Bank structural adjustment programs in Ghana. And when you listen to Rob HERSOV in this video, he actually argues that it seems that South Africa is getting close to an IMF bailout. And actually what an IMF bailout entails simply would be a weakening of state-owned capacity, so to speak. In other words, more privatization and less, state agency, so to speak, in the economic development of a state. And Rob HERSOV is actually arguing that South Africa is in so much debt. Debt is actually 76% of South Africa's GDP, according to Rob HERSOV, and actually is far, far, far higher than the safe threshold of the IMF, which is 60%. So in other words, the IMF expect that every country, so you remember they had the International Monetary Fund, they were actually set up along with the World Bank as what was called Bretton Woods institutions at the fallout of, towards the end of the Second World War, they're about to begin the reconstruction of the world after it had been devastated massively by the Second World War. And so they sort of like check these countries for balance in terms of their, probably debt spaces, so to speak. And I think even for Ghana at the time when I was studying, Ghana was actually set at a certain debt level where it now had to be set to be called a highly indebted poor country. That was an index, I think, set up by this institution at the time. It's called HIPC, all right? So the criteria for Ghana's entrance into the HIPC, highly indebted poor countries, is actually, I think, where South Africa is actually getting close to, because with a 76% debt to GDP ratio, which means that if the GDP, I think the GDP, according to Rob HERSOV, spoke about, I don't know if it was some 3 trillion or something, but I don't really remember the numbers anyway. But South Africa has a debt that actually is consuming as much as 76% of the GDP. In other words, while the country is actually producing, GDP stands for gross domestic product. So while the country is producing these goods and actually trying to really grow its economy in terms of the amount of productivity going on within the economy, the country owes to the tune of 76% of that productivity. In other words, if it produces probably 100 pineapples, for example. This is just in colloquial terms now, trying to really understand, even for myself. So if a farmer, for example, produces 100 oranges for export, that farmer now owes 76% of those 100 oranges. So 76 of those oranges would be used to service the debt, maybe the cost of the tractors, the cost of the, pitchforks and all the tools he has actually used to produce the 100 oranges. And so while at the end of the month, at the end of a week or a day, he has been able to produce 100 oranges, 76 of those would actually go back to the bank from where he had a loan. So at the end of the day, what he has left, to sell and probably take care of his family and all that at the end of the day is only 23 oranges, all right? So this is where South Africa actually is. So South Africa owes to the debt 76% of GDP as debt, all right? And Rob HERSOV argues now that this is actually way above the 60%. The IMF recommends that a country should be at least 60% of GDP in terms of servicing its debt, because we all know that in the new modern economics, or the new kind of like economic mechanisms that actually was since the 50s. I think borrowing has been a thing that countries actually borrow to grow their economies and all that. So in terms of this new mechanism, so to speak, the IMF thinks that a country is safe as long as it is within 60% of its debt servicing. So as much as it tries to borrow and grow, the rate at which it should pay back its debt should not be higher than 60%. Now, South Africa has exceeded that threshold by 16%, which is really critical to understand in the heat of Godongwana. I think that will be today. I think Godongwana will be addressing the budget. There was the 2% proposed VAT hike that would now, I think, is recommended. I think is 0.75% VAT hike to raise the 60 billion needed to prop up the economy. How that would address this 76% of GDP is really still not clear to me anyway. But anyway, HERSOV is also still arguing that, the IMF bailout, if South Africa gets to a point where the IMF would need to bail out the economy of South Africa, in other words, a bailout is actually sort of like coming in now, because now the country's at a really critical state. There's so much debt to GDP imbalances, and the IMF now has to bail out in terms of loans. But in terms of bailing out, the IMF would necessarily place what has been called conditionalities. This happened in Ghana in the 1980s as well. So the conditionalities at the time were the fact that I think one really interesting clause then was that the IMF wanted the left-wing vociferous rhetoric of death to imperialism and all that to be curtailed, and the government had to really sort of like take actions to really reduce the voices of left-wing activism, so to speak. So in other words, now that we see that, I see a lot of your comments and all that alluding to the fact that the ANC seems to be socialist left-wing, or aligning itself with socialist left-wing parties, and also with the fact of the National Democratic Revolution. This is a term that has been coming on and on, especially HERSOV speaks about that in this video. He argues that the bailout by the IMF would be a natural death to the National Democratic Revolution. And the ANC might not be really thinking about this, because as much as the country delves now deeper and deeper into debt and to a place where it might need an IMF bailout at some point, it would actually attack or probably cause a demise of its own vision, which is probably a national democratic revolution. So this is the argument from HERSOV, all right? Anyway, let's quickly listen to HERSOV break some of these things down. I'll be back for some final thoughts.
What's really happening in South Africa? One, South Africa's debt stands at 76% of GDP, way above the IMF's safe threshold of 60%. If debt becomes unpayable, South Africa has to apply for an IMF bailout, which will force the ANC to abandon its racist and socialist economic policies, marking the death of the National Democratic Revolution, NDR, and not a moment too soon in my view. Our economy is stalled. Growth is at a crippling 0.8%, less than 1%. The economy is flatlining. And public sector, all ANC cadres, and mostly useless and incompetent people, are draining the country's finances. We have 1.3 million public servants, and they're paid 30% more than private workers. This bloated bureaucratic monster consumes 700 billion rand annually. State-owned enterprises, let's call them, rather, ANC-destroyed, state-owned disasters. The SOEs are bloated and bankrupt, and they're bleeding money through ANC corruption and mismanagement. And all the ANC-run cities face power outages, water cuts, decaying infrastructure, all of which is a direct result of ANC corruption and nepotism. The DA knows how to run cities and provinces. The ANC only know how to break and steal. And taxes? Taxes. With South Africa already among the most taxed nations, what's the ANC's solution? Soak the rich again. So let me remind you, the GNU's non-ANC members strongly rejected the ANC's attempt to sneak in a 2% VAT increase at the last minute, and they are correctly demanding spending cuts instead. Enoch, you listening? From the outside world, the cancellation of USAID money, the potential loss of AGOA privileges, and Trump's new tariffs, maybe sanctions, are upping the pressure on our already fragile economy. As always, the facts speak for themselves. The ANC's racist and socialist-inspired policies are unsustainable. How long can South Africa borrow from the future to fund ANC's corruption today? What happens if and when the IMF refuses a bailout? Can the ANC's mafia and corrupt patronage network survive real spending cuts? And will South Africa provoke America into shutting the door on future loans? Is the ANC, with the useless Cyril the chief clown, sleepwalking South Africa into economic collapse?
Right. HERSOV is also still criticizing the government and the economy in South Africa, saying that South Africa has 1.3 million public servants that are actually paid more than private workers. I think in a video also, he was actually speaking about how South Africa has the second highest number of embassies in the world, and he argues that these embassies are retirement homes for many ANC men. This is actually a repressive argument, but he argues that if some of these embassies could be sold off, closed down, the land sold, that could bring a lot of money into the coffers and actually help support the 60 billion Minister Godongwana argues that South Africa needs at this time. But also, he then actually goes on to say that South Africa might expect sanctions from the US. He's been going around a lot, and I'll be making a next video where he replies MK MP Douglas, who actually called for him to be placed on the treason list in South Africa. I'll be making that video soon, but he actually argues that South Africa might actually be expecting sanctions from Donald Trump, who is actually just setting the stage ready. HERSOV argues that Donald Trump is right now negotiating with Russia because right now they think that Russia is really weak, all right? So they're negotiating with Russia to pull out their support from Iran, pull out their support from, I think, some of these American enemies, and stabilize the, critical minerals deal in the Ukraine so that American businesses can actually operate in the Ukraine, but thereby provide security for Ukraine to actually be a buffer to the aggression by Russia. I think he argues that the agreement might be that Russia keeps Donbass, Russia will keep, what's that other state, Crimea, and then when all of this is set, it will now turn its face fully to South Africa. And one of those things that might go would be AGOA, and then how that whole thing plays out for South Africa, bro. I'm really worried. But anyway, let's quickly listen to HERSOV actually break down some of these arguments in this really short video. I think it's about 4 minutes. I got it from his, from his YouTube channel. Really, I think it just made me think about a lot of things. And so I don't know, what do you guys think, man? Share your thoughts in the comments.